quoting it from this. Some of you familiar with this book, Clarinet Classics? Okay, I talked about this last year. It might even have been with you. Did you play Weber last year also?
Yeah.
Yeah, you did. Okay. There are now editions of these Weber works that you can buy, published by Henle, which is a publisher in Europe, that are that show you actually what Weber wrote, and also give a separate clarinet part that show what the Behrmans sort of added to it. And it's really great to have that because there are so many editions like this one that are filled with really, really strange, number one, mistakes, and also editorial choices that are also very strange and anachronistic. And it's better to see what Weber wrote and what Weber's first performers, who were Behrman, father and son, did to the music when they performed it. So that's just, as you get closer to actually performing this, which you're already very close indeed. And like, in fact, some of the hardest passages you played the best, which is great. So we've talked about fundamentals before. So in terms of playing a wind instrument, what's the most fundamental of all the fundamentals? Air, right. So you being not as big as you're soon going to be, you got to make sure you use your entire air capacity every time you breathe, so that you never find yourself at the ends of some of these very long phrases just running out of gas and having to, you don't have time to fill up again. Heinrich Behrman, for whom these pieces were written, must have had a really tremendous air capacity. Not just because of the passages in these Weber works, because each of the pieces, particularly the two concertos, have at least one passage where you really can't make it. You have to leave something out or really get a couple of quick extra breaths to get through it. But the pieces he wrote for himself to play are even worse. They have these very, very long stretches where there's just nowhere to breathe. So he must have, I don't think he circular breathed, but he must have, apparently he was a barrel-chested man. He must have just been sort of superhuman. But that's just the first thing. So before you start, as you're thinking 1 and 2 and 3, and make sure you breathe on the upbeat rather than on the 8th note rest. Then you'll have plenty of time to take a relaxed, full breath. Start it one more time. Okay, so what's the title of this movement?
Polacca.
Polacca. So what have you, in your scholarly research on this concerto, learned about what a polacca is?
Nothing.
Okay, it's a musical form that's meant for what activity? Praying, singing, dancing, celebrating, which of those?
Probably dancing.
Good, that's a very good answer. It's sort of a relative, like a mazurka. It's a Polish dance. So, and it's, one of its features is the syncopated idea that it starts with. So you want it to sound more bouncy, right? So it's not just a ba, be, ba, which was fine, you executed it really well. But can you make it sound a little more playful, like the people dancing to it are having a little more fun? Because they've probably been celebrating in a particular way that you'll know more about when you go to college. That makes them a little less inhibited, okay? So try it one more time. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is so notice that they all have an accent. So what does an accent look like? Besides an accent, what else looks like that shape?
Dynamic.
Yeah, diminuendo, right? So you just started a little bit more than where you finished it. So instead of, which is fine, just give it a little more, so it has a bounce to it, right? Like you would lift your foot to it. Try that. And also phrased to the second bar. Yeah. So let me count you in. 1 and 2 and 3 and go. Good. Keep going. Keep going. Okay, good. So these rhythms are very particularly written. The ones you just played, the double dotted notes, right? So if you were to play that measure at half the tempo you just played, how would it sound? Da, dee, da, dee, that tempo. So that's a, that's right. That's very good, Eric, and it sounds terrific. So I would make sure that you practice it that way a lot, so that when you actually execute it, it doesn't change the actual rhythm that's printed to something else. Or, and you can even spell it out for yourself. Because when you play played it in tempo, it was a little sort of approximate. You want this to be really, really snappy and rhythmic. So could you practice that measure once for me with exaggerated accuracy? Good. So the trickiest part of that is going from C to D, right? So how are we going to find the sweet spot of how we're going to shape this to get the D? How would you improve that? Yeah, me either. But one thing I sometimes think is easy to try is to try to play that D, find where it speaks with no register key and no first finger. Because this fingering you can play B flat, F, and D, right? But if you can find them all with no register key, then you'll know exactly how little you actually have to move the inside of your mouth, mostly the tongue. Can you just try those two notes, but don't use the register key after you play the C? Yeah. All right. So this is something that you want to think about, because the registration on the instrument is controlled by extremely subtle movements that none of us can see inside the oral cavity, mostly to do with the tongue. And my teacher used to describe it as taking that E syllable that we talk about to pronounce to get the upper register to speak. It's just more E the higher you go. Because if you take, let's just take a C major arpeggio from the bottom of the instrument, and I will play it with no adjustment of the tongue whatsoever. Okay, that's what you get. But if you think E, more E the higher you go. Right? Then it comes out great. So you just need to know where is the sweet spot for that D, so that when you go, you know exactly, because there is an adjustment there. It's very, very small. So that's what I would say about that. So that's just to work on. Now, I'm taking a lot of time with very, very little. Can we do slowly this passage? Because you played it super well, and I want to hear you play it slowly. It's like you go, da-dee, da-dee, da-dee. Great, that's super. So can you do it one more time and just make more crescendo? Make more crescendo, use more air. However, yeah, don't turn it into triplets. Really count it out. So most of us at ages much older than Eric is now have struggled with this spot, right? It's kind of a nightmare to voice it. Remember a couple things. Try to put the air out in front of your eyes rather than focusing it down here. That will help maintain and get rid of some of those grunty, those noises, right? And as you go faster, you just need to support it more with the air. But that was super good. Now let's talk about on the next page, because yeah, starting here. Would you play it again and actually play forte? Here in your ear before you start the sound just ringing around the whole room, because the orchestra plays this big tutti and then all of a sudden it's just you. Nobody else plays in that part. So make sure it's adequate to the orchestra tutti that just finished. Yeah. Great, that's great. That's what I would call correct. Now, play it as if you're a little more dramatic soprano rather than clarinet student, okay? So, in other words, this doesn't have to be a solid eighth note, because it's a grace note. Try to float between the notes instead of just, okay? Yes, good. Go on. Okay, good. That's great. The only thing I would say is that if you were playing it in a larger concert hall, you would need to get your sound out more. You play with a big orchestra now, right? It's loud. right? Where you have to really like, everything going on in there, it's like it's got to light up the reed. Right? So can you play with a little more sound? Because once you thought about singing, the in between the notes here was terrific. And then make sure you phrase to this D and then come off it a little bit, just like it's marked. Okay, that's good, but it's like mezzo piano. Do it again. Practice it for me. Show me how you practice it. Good. Good. That's super. That's super. This sort of practicing will result eventually in a really brilliant performance. It will take some time because it's very, very rapid finger movements. The one thing I would say is imagine the downward motion to have a little bit of a crescendo. Because otherwise it will sound like a diminuendo, just based on the sort of sounds like a diminuendo, right? So really, and then just make sure the air follows you down through this long passage. Okay, and then make the diminuendo only then. That's great. Let's start. One last idea. Let's start here. So scherzando meaning, how does this music feel when you play? Yeah. Literally it means jocular, joking. So yes, playful would probably be the right word. So just play it and then we'll talk about practicing it. Yeah, I think that it would probably work better if you slurred the little note to the connecting note. I think it probably will sound better that way. Slow it down, it's a new idea. I think that'll be better. I think that because it's very hard to execute. It doesn't really necessarily. It sounds more like work than play there. Show me slowly how you. This is another nightmare passage for all of us. Could you practice that one? Okay, so let me talk just to everyone about that spot and how I would approach it. Beyond the fact that he played it slowly, how the fingers are going to work there, because that's a tough one, right? So my teacher used to talk about, and I know we've talked about it because I can see you doing it, about prepared finger staccato. Or fingers ahead? Does that sound familiar? It's a technique of wind playing that goes back well over 100 years to the Paris Conservatory. It basically involves when you have separated notes, getting the fingers into position early. So this is a classic example because you're not only dealing with finger movements, but registrational changes. So in very slow motion, it looks like this. So that you're really sort of taking as much of the gamble out of that passage as possible, because at the tempo it goes, it's extremely difficult to play. So it's a lot of technique on clarinet is just planning ahead for where everything needs to be. Let me talk also about that arpeggio passage. As you practice it slowly, you must practice it slowly with very fast motions of the fingers. Because sometimes when we play something slowly, it's meant to be slowly in performance, so we're using a gentle legato finger motion. But in this case, we're preparing to play rapidly. So it will be something like that rather than. If you practice it like that, you're not really preparing yourself to execute it rapidly down the road, because it's. And the same goes for your scales and arpeggios, which I know all of you practice every day for at least an hour. And when you're learning scales, it's always. It's not, because you're learning them to eventually be able to execute extremely rapidly. You can always play them legato when you need to, but it will be hard to execute, and of course faster than that with the legato finger motion. Eric, I know I will see you again soon, so very good job. So it sounds great. Thank you. Okay, who's next?